My name is Elizabeth Kapp, and I'm the curator of exhibitions here at the Arizona Heritage Center at Papago Park, which is in Tempe. And my co-host here is Isabel Cazares. She's an archivist and librarian, also at our Tempe location. A few helpful reminders as we start this evening. If you have comments or questions during the presentation, please write them in the Q&A section that you can find at the bottom of your screen. We will do our best to answer them at the end of the presentation.
I have to unmute myself. So welcome. The Arizona Historical Society, if you don't know, is a nonprofit organization and a state agency. We're established around 1864, really started collecting 1880s. We have 4 locations across the state. We are coming from you from the Tempe location, as Liz said, but we do have one in Arizona History Museum in Tucson, Sanguinetti House in Yuma, and the Pioneer Museum in Flagstaff. So if you're in that local area, please check us out or make a road trip to us. I promise we're worth it. Our mission actually is to connect people through the power of Arizona's history. We try to do that through programs like this, where we explore topics in our history that's shared throughout cultures and nations, as well as through exhibits and, just having research and resources available to the public. In fact, our mission is collecting, preserving, and telling the stories of Arizona's past through our exhibits, library archives, historic sites that we own, and of course, the quarterly journal we put out, the Journal of Arizona History. All of that leads to me saying, stay connected. You will want to know what's coming up. Sign up to become a member. You get that journal for free. Our email newsletter is great for knowing what's coming up. Social media, or our license plate, this wonderful monsoon one that you see on the screen. And a lot of the proceeds of that go back to the museum. And of course, if you're just interested on anything, go to our website, azhs.org. And on that, I'll hand it back over to Liz.
And speaking of some upcoming opportunities for everyone, you can join us on May 18th at noon for our next virtual program, where we'll be hosting author and historian Lynn Downey as she discusses the history of dude ranches and her newest work, American Dude Ranch, A Touch of the Cowboy and the Thrill of the Old West, pictured there on the left. But also, I want to remind everyone not to forget to visit our exhibit, Rebuilding Home Plate, Baseball in Arizona's Japanese American Incarceration Camps. While it's still up at the Arizona Heritage Center, it will be open for public viewing until May 27th, and then it has to, unfortunately, go away. But don't forget to check back with us in June, where we will have more programs and events to share with you guys. But to get us started, I would like to introduce Paula Fujiwara, MD, MPH, as she has a celebrated medical career working closely on tuberculosis issues across the country and the world. She is also a descendant of the Japanese Americans imprisoned at the Tule Lake concentration camp in California. Paula?
I'm going to stop my share so she can start her presentation.
Okay, well, thank you very much to the Arizona Historical Society for having me. Food sustains us in many ways. Its production requires months of planning, nurturing, worrying, and even so much anxiety as the farmers have to watch the weather, and this is the one thing that nature controls. Food is fuel for the body. Food is a source of memories, both good and bad. And food in the incarceration camps experienced by Japanese Americans also was a tool of power and a tool of resistance. I will concentrate on the power dynamics of 3 intertwined food themes: that between the inmates of the War Relocation Authority officials, they're called the WRA, in charge of incarcerating the Japanese Americans, how the way meals were provided led to a breakdown in the family structure, and the tension among the so-called pro-American Japanese and those whose upbringing favored a more Japanese consensus style of interaction. In part 2, I will concentrate primarily on the production of food and the power dynamics of the US government with both the Japanese American inmates, specifically those of the Gila River and Poston camps, and the people of the Gila River Indian community and the Colorado Indian tribes on whose ancestral land these camps are located. I acknowledge with respect the Acumel, Otham, and Peeposh peoples of the Gila River Indian community and the Mojave, Chemehuevi, Hopi, and Navajo peoples of the Colorado River Indian tribes. Our histories are intertwined. Although this is about the food, dynamics of food production and consumption in the camps, I'm going to start by sharing some of the context regarding this shameful part of American history. I'm going to be now using the accepted terms of detention centers and concentration camps rather than the euphemistic assembly centers and internment or relocation camps, and this is in line with the Civil Liberties Public Education Fund and historians. And this is in no way meant to undermine the experience of Holocaust survivors and their families who experienced the Nazi death camps of World War II. For those of you who are new to some of the terminology, I'm going to introduce 4 terms. First is the Issei, and these are the sojourners, the people who first came to the United States to seek their fortune. And then with time, they had families, and these were called the Nisei, second generation. These are birthright. These are people that are citizens by birthright, and they were sent back, and they were also another kind of Nisei, were called Kibei. And these were also birthright citizens, but many of them were sent back to Japan for education or work, and it was often the oldest members of the children. But some of these Nisei and Kibei also had children themselves, and these are called Sansei, or the 3rd generation. No matter where they were in the family structure, they were all inmates. Now, I belong to the 3rd generation, and I grew up in Sacramento, California. I'm on an extended family and community of Japanese Americans, and my grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, family, friends were all incarcerated between 1942 and 1946, even though the war had been over, in these sanctioned War Relocation Authority camps, primarily in Tule Lake and also in Jerome, Rower, Gila River, and Amachi. Now, people think that anti-Japanese sentiment started with the bombing of Pearl Harbor. It all started on that day, December 7th, 1941, the day, so-called Day of Infamy by President Roosevelt, and which precipitated the entry of the US into World War II. However, I'm going to show you in this slide how anti-Japanese sentiment actually was going on for decades. And here are some key dates. 1882, this is the Chinese Exclusion Act. The country, however, still needs people to work the land. So Chinese are no longer available, but they say the Japanese can come in. And by 1907, and 20 years passed by, and between 1907 and 1908, there was a gentleman's agreement to restrict the flow of Japanese people. And the reason why they did this is that there was a movement to segregate Japanese children within the schools in San Francisco. And so the governments of both countries said, okay, don't segregate, and the Japanese government says, fine, we will not bring in more people. However, there was an exception. If you were already in the country, you can bring in family members, wives, and children. So you can see here that in December of 1906, the Japanese and Korean Exclusion League. So it was not just the Japanese, but also against another group, the Koreans. And so people were coming in, Japanese people were coming in, people were getting scared. There was an influx of all these people of Japanese ancestry, and they're pouring in. And so what happened in 1913 was the California Alien Land Law. And this was target against the Japanese from owning land, but also included those people such as the Koreans, the Indians, and the Chinese. And this culminated in 1924 with the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act, which prohibited any kind of Asian immigration. So again, this was not just an overnight event. This is something that had been going on for years. So what happened? That very day, that evening, the next day, and the next weeks, there was a roundup of people, language instructors, Buddhist priests, business owners, fishermen. These are the husbands, the fathers, and the main breadwinners of their families. They were taken away, and sometimes their family never found out what happened. I call your attention to this little duffel case in the middle. What does this mean? There was a gentleman named Mr. Iwasaki, and he was a leader in the community, and he said to himself, I'm going to be arrested. I may be arrested. So he actually prepared a duffel bag, and his daughter would come down into the room every morning and see if that duffel bag was still there. Fortunately, he was not arrested, but many others were. And on February 19th, 1942, President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066, saying that all persons of Japanese ancestry had to be evacuated, removed from the West Coast for, quote, their protection. And on April 1st, you see this sign here. Notices were placed in all Japanese American communities for removal within a few weeks to detention centers called assembly centers. And these were often horse racing tracks or fairgrounds where they were housed in stalls. Homes, businesses, farms had to be sold quickly and pets abandoned. You can see in my background where on my slide that this was a sign that was actually 2 blocks away from where my grandparents and my mother's family was located in Sacramento. So what happened that they had to sell their goods, their cars, their homes, their businesses, and even get rid of some of their pets. And this photo documentation was coordinated by the US government. And here we see 2 photos by the photographer Dorothea Lange on some of the effects of this starting of this incarceration. Many of her photos were actually impounded by the Japanese government. And the symbolism has another symbolism of the suitcase. And that was, these were told in this sign, take only what you could carry. So by the end of 1942, the government starts to move 120,000 Japanese Americans from the West Coast. There were 10 concentration camps built. There was 1 each in Idaho, Wyoming, Utah, and Colorado. There were actually 2 in Arizona, which I'll be speaking about in greater detail in the second part of this talk, 2 in California, Manzanar and Tule Lake, and actually 2 more in the eastern part of the country in Arkansas, Rower and Jerome. They were moved in trains and buses. They were told to keep the shades down. It would take 3 to 4 days just to cross from here, especially to places such as Arkansas. And they were told to keep the window shades down. So under very difficult circumstances. 2/3 of these people were American citizens, 1/3 of them were children. And you can see in this photograph in the lower right, picture taken by a Japanese American photographer. Japanese Americans were not allowed to bring in cameras initially, but this gentleman sneaked in a camera and he took a picture of this, of the barbed wire fences and the guard towers that were pointed with guns to the inside of the camp. The government photographers were told specifically, do not take picture of the barbed wire, do not take picture of these guard towers. So let me talk about the power dynamics under the War Relocation Authority. Now, these camps held about 8,000 to 18,000 people. They were designed as Army barracks, and you can see here in the left, the row upon row of barracks, and a schematic of how they were developed. So you have here, these are about, they were 4 in each barrack. They're ranged from 20 feet by 16, 20 by 20, and 20 by 24 feet. Depending on the size of the family, you could get 1 or 2. And they did not have any plumbing, so you had to use the facilities in a men's or women's restroom, and the laundry had to be done in a separate facility also. The food, you cannot prepare food. There was no ability to prepare food, although people did get some hot plates, and they were done in mess halls, so people had to have every single meal. This was run by white administrators who lived outside the camp perimeter, and they were the ones that were responsible for developing the laws. And one of the things that happened very early was that wages were set, and these wages were $12, $16, and $19 per month. In this presentation, I'll be showing you each of the camps had their own newsletter. So here's one from Tule Lake, and the $19 was reserved for people like doctors, dentists, pharmacists, people who were in the professions. The rest of the people, including the farm laborers, got about $16 per month. So these places were supposed to be run like typical American towns. So here's from the Rower Outpost Community Council, but the problem was that this is where the power dynamics came into play, and that only American citizens could apply. And remember that the Issei, the first generation, could not be American citizens. So this responsibility devolved to their children, the Nisei. And here you see a picture about Ansel Adams showing a community council meeting. However, it really gave them a false sense of control, because ultimately a WR administrator could have veto power. There was also a series of what they call block managers, because they had to have the people that had the ability to also speak Japanese. So many of these were among the first generation Issei. The administration was also responsible in the middle of the war for developing or administering what was called a loyalty questionnaire. It's a 4-page questionnaire, and it ended with these 2 questions, 27 and 28, which still resonate to this day among the Japanese American community. 27 said, "Are you willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States on combat duty wherever ordered?" This was revised for people who could not, for example, the elderly who could not serve in combat. And number 28, will you swear unqualified allegiance to the United States of America, faithfully dependent from any or all attack by foreign or domestic forces, and forswear any allegiance or obedience to the Japanese emperor or any other foreign government, etc. So you could answer yes, yes. You could answer no, no. You could answer yes, no. You could answer no, yes. You could actually say, I'm not going to answer the questions. And this caused an enormous amount of problems, in which I'll get to in the next few slides. This shows the whole issue of farming among the Japanese community. Remember, the Japanese immigration didn't start until the late 1880s after the Chinese Exclusion Act. And by 1908, they started to dominate agriculture. And by 1940, they only had 2% of the land, was responsible for about 30% of the food crops. This caused a lot of jealousy among the white farmers. They did not take the prime land. They took land that was not very well used, developed it, and then by 1940 they were running a lot of the farms. Here we have a picture of a family that was raising strawberries, and ironically, here's a soldier right before the war. He's given a furlough to come to his mother in Florin, who has some strawberries here. She had just gotten this land through her family, but now she had to give it to go through detention. One of the issues was that Tule Lake was deemed an agricultural product from the start. The land was fertile. Remember, this started in April when they were said you have to go be detained away from your homes. And then by August 30th, 1942, they already had planted these crops. And the idea was that the camps were going to be self-sufficient for their own food. And Tule Lake was deliberately set up to be able to grow its food and also to sell to some of the other camps and also on the open market. Ironically, however, there's some of the incarcerees had to be used to rescue the potato crops and the beet crops in other states, as the white farmers were were going and joining the army. The pay was better for them, but they had to promise that guarantee that their family members left behind would be cared for. The other issue is that in the lower left-hand photo, you see these are farmers at Tule Lake who had already had their own farms and relegated to farm labor for that $16 a month. There was a lot of resentment and rebellion ensued. There was inadequate food, inadequate clothing, the equipment was bad, and the final straw was an accident where a young inmate was killed. So the inmates, they said, struck, we have control. We can actually harvest these, we have to harvest these crops. So we have the upper hand. But however, they were outwitted by the WR director who brought in inmates from other camps, and he paid them $1 an hour. And remember, the incarcerees at Tule Lake were only getting $16 per month. Martial law was declared in November of 1943, and the army was actually brought in to Tule Lake. What happens is that 200 inmates were arrested and put into a stockade, a temporary stockade within the camp. So the idea of a prison within a prison. And there was a diary kept by a Mr. Inoue in Japanese, and he recorded over 2 months, he recorded every single meal that he had while he was in the stockade. So here's Thanksgiving dinner. In the morning, 2 pieces of bread and coffee. At lunch, we had a little spaghetti and rice and tea. And by dinner, we had more rice, some cabbage mixed with weenies and carrots. At the beginning of the year, they went on a hunger strike for 7 days. Let me move to the power dynamics within the family. When the men first came, they came as sojourners. They were there to make their money and go back to Japan and live out their life there. However, they started to stay, and by 1908, the men, as I mentioned in the gentleman's agreement, were allowed to bring in their women as wives as picture brides. My 2 grandmothers themselves were picture brides. Some of them may have been deceived. They're going to go and marry a man that was very rich or prosperous or had a big farm, but some of them were actually going to their small farms, relegated not into working in the fields, but also having to provide the meals for the farm hands that were also on the land. Children were born. Fathers ruled the home, followed by their sons. Then coming last were the daughters and the mother. For the parents, there was this concept of kodomo no tameni, meaning for the sake of the children. But the dynamics between the parents and the children were already beginning to shift before the incarceration. As American citizens, these children can go on land. They serve as translators for their parents. They become Americanized. And so when the incarceration started, as exemplified here, here's a family, each one with a numbered tag, getting ready to be transported to a detention center. Again, noting the bags in the corner with only what we could carry. As I said, there was no plumbing, no facilities for cooking within the barracks, so people had to eat in these mess halls. And although some people did improvise with hot plates, this is a family picture showing my uncle and the kitchen crew. He worked in the kitchen crew. And you can see here that here's some men with their chef's hats. Some of these men, some of them had owned restaurants, but many of them had never been in the kitchen before, but they became the chefs. And they had to follow a WRA controlled menu of rationed food, and that was set at 45 cents per day per person. Although with time and production of produce and also livestock, this amount was also reduced. And in some unanticipated way, the women who had actually provided the food, cooked the food, et cetera, were relegated, and this task was taken away. Maybe it gave them more leisure time, but it also removed some of their agency. And so you can see here that here are the women actually serving on the lines. And again, my grandmother told me that she was a dishwasher in one of the camps. The lines were long. You can see here in the hot sun waiting to get in. Here within the mess hall itself, people coming through the lines and getting their food. Food was not often palatable. One official called it edible offal, and the inmates called it awful edibles. And between the meals, some of these spaces were used for special occasions, dances, special church services, films. But in the winter of 1943, they were used in discussions and debates about this loyalty questionnaire. So here are some of the typical scenes, but I call your attention. You can see that the crowding, kids eating with their friends, mother along with their children, men eating alone. But I call your attention to the picture in the middle. So even the artists were documenting camp life. And you can see here at the end, and the signs, it says, no second serving, and milk for children and sick people only. There was a war going on. That means that there was rationing. So even the people in the camps had to ration. For example, here's a ration book for sugar. And here's my uncle with the kitchen crew again, but I call your attention to the sign here. The sign in the back says, because of rationing, go eat at your own hall. Because people were jumping from hall to hall. Maybe the food was better in one hall to the other. My uncle, who was a teenager at the time, was part of the garbage crew. And he said that as part of going to pick up garbage, he'd stop in and eat at several mess halls on the way. And he also mentioned that, you know, there was one cook that every week made chili, and it was better than anything he'd ever had. But on an ironic note, the WA was also asking for volunteers to go rescue that beet crop, and the beet crop was the source of the sugar. So what about tension among the inmates? Remember I mentioned the loyalty questionnaire, and there were those who answered yes, yes, so they volunteered to fight, even despite being incarcerated. Later on, the draft happened, and these men became part of either a secret military intelligence service and served as translators, or became part of a segregated unit of Japanese Americans and Japanese Hawaiians, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, and also the 100th Infantry Battalion that fought in some of the fiercest battles of World War II in Europe, and became the most decorated unit of its size and length of service during the war. And the right, again, the artist, same artist, Mr. Sugimoto, who actually documents the painful parting of the son from his parents within the confines of the camp, showing that mess hall, the WA truck, and the grayness of the barracks. There were some people, however, in the lower left-hand corner who became draft resistors, the no-no boys, as they were called. And this was in one of the camps in Montana, Hart Mountain, where 63 of them said, we are not going to go. They had a trial in front of a judge, and they were incarcerated for 3 years. However, President Truman, after the war, actually pardoned all draft resistors, including them. And there was another group that actually renounced their citizenship and indicated their desire to go back to Japan for whatever reason, patriotic and sometimes familiar reasons. So this was in the middle of 1943. Tule Lake was actually designated as a segregation center, and these people were actually moved in, and others who said they were yes, yes, they wanted to stay, they were moved to some of the other camps. This slide shows one of the most egregious issues regarding food and power and the tensions among the inmates, and this is called the Manzanar Uprising. In the upper left-hand corner, we see a young group, well-dressed, and I can tell you now that they're all citizens. How do I know this? Because they're holding the sign. They're part of the Japanese American Citizens League, and that told it all. You had to be a citizen in order to be a part of this organization, which meant that their parents who were Issei's could not be joining. These people were the favorites of the World Relocation Authority. And in the lower left are some of the typical Japanese Americans. These are the primarily Japanese speaking Issei and the Kibe. Remember, these are the ones that had a lot of their schooling in Japan, and they made up most of the kitchen staff in the camps. This is a low prestige jobs. They had very little power at the WRA. And these two groups actually clashed throughout the summer of 1942 when the JCLers actually lost an election, and the WRA said, oh my God, we cannot have this happen. So they intervened and said that the rules state that only citizens could hold elective office, and they elected an Issei group to actually draft the charter rules. In the middle is a picture of Mr. Harry Ueno. He was a Kibe, a cook's assistant, and he organized in Manzanar a group of mess hall workers and did some investigations and brought grievances to the WRA. He noticed when he was on the other side of the fence where the staff lived that there was plenty of sugar on the table. Yet in the actual mess halls of the incarcerees, there was little to none. He did an investigation. He found that 20,000 pounds of sugar were missing. He accused the assistant camp administrator of taking these sacks of sugar out of the camp in the trunk of his car. This was witnessed by some of the police who happened to be the Japanese Americans in the camp. And he also accused him of selling meat and stealing the fruit and cookies meant for the children. The tensions started to rise, and it was not helped by the favoring of this pro-American group by the WRA authorities. And on the first anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor, a JCL leader was beaten, a riot broke out, and this is now known as the Manzanar Uprising. One of the other camps in Idaho, in Minidoka, said 1 was killed and 9 were hurt. Actually, 2 people were actually killed. And when I did research to see what was going on in Manzanar, the actual camp where it was happening, there was nothing to be mentioned about this. Mr. Ueno, considered one of the instigators of this riot, was actually shipped off to a special camp in Arizona, which I'll be talking about in a few minutes. So let me move to now talk about specifically about Gila River and Poston concentration camps, which are located in Arizona. These are the 2 camps that were actually built on Native American reservations. And on the upper left, you can see Gila River. Notice here that the walls are white and the roofs are a little bit different. It's just to allow for more ventilation given the hot climate, and some trees are growing. In Poston was different because actually what they used was and made were adobe bricks to create, create some of the buildings. And on the right is a art project done by an artist that's called Winchester, who used each bowl represented 1,000 inmates, and she went to each of the 10 concentration camps and laid them out in various configurations. And this one is in Gila River. In the back, you can see the Butte Monument, which honored the Japanese soldiers. And in the bottom, you can see them in the family configurations, as she calls them, in front of some of the barracks. This slide's very important in terms of the relationship between the Japanese American and the Native American camps. So on the left, we have the Department of Agriculture, Dylan Meyer, who was the second director of the WRA. And then on the right, we have what was then called the Office of Indian Affairs, and John Collier, who was the commissioner of this office. And he was a commissioner for a long time, even before the war, the longest serving commissioner, 1933 to 1945. So what happened, he's saying, so Dylan Meyer, as part of the Department of Agriculture, he knew where the land was. He knew that where there could be camps set up. John Collier, on the other hand, said, oh, I have experience. I already run this Office of Indian Affairs. I know how to take care of incarcerated people. John Collier actually wanted Dylan Meyer's job, but Dylan Meyer was appointed after the war. Dylan Meyer actually became the commissioner of then reorganized Bureau of Indian Affairs. This is the middle of the war. So this got involved with the United States of America War Office. They first started, they said, remember in California, this was blocked off. You can Japanese could not live on the West Coast. So they said, let's try voluntary, what they called voluntary resettlement. Some people went east, most people did not. So they moved this responsibility over to the Wartime Civil Control Administration. This was the group that actually had they put up those signs that you saw earlier, and then the responsibility then devolved to this War Relocation Authority. Now, why Gila River and why Poston? There's various reasons, but these finally were chosen, and this is the reaction. First of all, both of these were controlled by the Office of Indian Affairs, and both tribes actually objected to having the Japanese American put on their lands. The tribal councils of both tribes, the tribal council at Gila River said, we want community input. This was announced in May of 42. They didn't actually agree until October of 42, after the inmates had been put into place. And they noticed that their tribal members were not prioritized for any employment. the US government did not pay the community any rent because they said, we promise we'll develop your land and we'll make a road through the reservation. But in 1971, they had to sue the US government because for breach of contract for not restoring these lands of the campsites. In Poston, they said, we don't want to participate because this is an injustice. But then they were overruled. And both of these tribes knew that if they actually continued to object, that the land would be taken away from them, the land that they really didn't own that was in trust with the US government. Now, John Collier, remember, he had been a commissioner for a while, for many, many years. He'd always been trying to get more resources. He's a controversial figure. He wanted to get more resources for the Native Americans. He was a sociologist by training, but he found out that the war fund, there was going to be a US government war fund that was going to pay for infrastructure improvements. He said, okay, this is my chance. I can now build some roads. I can do some irrigation. I can get more water into these lands. So this is part of the reason why he wanted to have these on tribal lands. And the whole plan was for this long range development for afterwards that they were going to have colonist Native Americans from other areas of the country move into this land. There's a very difficult relationship between the US government and the Japanese Americans and the Native Americans. And I take this work from Professor Leong and Carpio, who are basically at Arizona State University. And they wrote an article called Carceral Subjugations. So here's the intersection. Both experienced forced migration. They had no right to property. Remember the alien land law, and the Native Americans actually had their property taken away. This whole idea of coercion, we were coerced off the land. A carceral state, basically we were made prisoners. And Native Americans earlier in the century had been made prisoners and put onto their lands. Wards of the state, settler colonization. What happened to the native lands is a lot of this was given to the white settlers. And for the Japanese Americans, their land that they had cultivated around the other states were taken away from them. And even in the war, the Japanese were in a segregated war unit, and the Navajo, we know about the Navajo code talkers, and both the MIS and the Navajo code talkers were not allowed to talk about their contributions to the war effort until the late 60s and early 70s. And then I put this shadow around the Japanese Americans because they had the Native Americans had the additional insult of having these people come on to their land, negating their history, negating their self-determination, their sovereignty. Japanese Americans being prisoner laborers, but we were also touted as model minority. We were very self-sufficient. We can rescue this land. The Native Americans can't do this. So it was said that we could do this for them. Very complicated relationship. So these two seals represent the Gila River community and the Colorado Indian tribes, and very similar. The blue skies showing that there's sunshine, abundant sunshine, even the rays, there are 52 rays around here showing the 52 weeks of the year, so there's sunshine. The importance of farming, and here you see here the plots of land on both of these seals. And even historically, the Gila River Indian community were great farmers and provided food for the Spaniards that first came, for example, and grew many different kinds of crops. And on the Colorado Indian tribes, we had the wheat and we had the cotton that they grew. And these 4 feathers represent the 4 different tribes of the Colorado River tribes. I just want to show you this. So Gila River is just south of Phoenix. Poston is in the west near the California border. But notice that both of them are actually within the exclusion zone. And I show the extent of the stripes, show the exclusion zone, and I show here some of the detention centers where people came from. And then actually these people, these farmers, a lot of them were farmers, were brought in to many of these camps. That said, only about 1/3 of them were farmers. Many were children, many were too old to work, many were urban, some were in universities. And it was noted by one Issei researcher that only about 10 to 15% were actually available for actual labor. But Arizona was also home to at least 5 other detention centers. I credit poet Brandon Shimoda, and also the Densho Sites of Shame, which has now recognized over 100 detention sites around the country. So we had Loop. Remember that the gentleman who was part of the Manzanar uprising, he was actually sent to Loop, which is outside of Flagstaff. Again, nothing there left there except for the supervisor's house. Florence, Arizona, which was at that time was Arizona's largest POW camp, became the future home of the first state prison. Tucson, there was another prison, I think now abandoned. Mayer, which is outside of Prescott, where all the Japanese in southern Arizona were first incarcerated before being sent to the individual camps, and a place called Dragoon. And for those of you in Arizona, it was just east of Benson at something called the Triangle T Dude Ranch. And it incarcerated 23 Japanese consulate staff that were actually sent there from Hawaii. So why? Why was it Gila River and why was it Poston? Because they had several things in common. Number one, they were isolated. They all had land around them so they could land. But you could notice they had water. So we had here the Colorado River here, and also you could see that there were canals around Gila River. And also they were crisscrossed by transportation, railroad lines, and roads. And there was a report from the Spanish delegation, which was responsible for the Japanese Americans through the Imperial Japan. And they said, this is a quote from the report, which I was able to get at the Arizona Historical Society. This site is selected on account of agricultural development. It has an available water supply. The land can be irrigated and cultivated. There's an adequate supply of electrical power. And ultimately, there's going to use the land and other resources by the Indian Service for colonization of American Indians. So this is all part of the plan. So what was grown? So we have here on the left what was grown in Gila River and what was grown in Poston. Obviously, there was produce in both places. They also developed feed crops, different kinds of feed crops in the different in the different camps. There was livestock. There's cattle and chickens and hogs in Gila, and also chickens, fish, and fish for a while, and hogs in Poston, although the fish didn't work out. There were also what they call war crops, guayuli, a substitute rubber, and other crops. But what's unique about Gila River was they developed seed crops to actually give to the other 8 camps, and the other thing that was noticeable is that some of the products, which I've underlined in green, were actually traditional Japanese foods. So they were growing these, and you can see that they're very, very, very common. But what I thought was interesting in this report from the Spanish delegation to Poston is that they said these are not produce, but these are some items that are produced by the project, and they actually said the words in Japanese: aburaage, tofu, miso, daikon. Tsukemono. But they also said there were things that could be bought outside of the project, and they mentioned rice, shoyu or soy sauce, ajinomoto, MSG, nori, seaweed, and dry shrimp. Some pictures. The government documented all of this work. They wanted to show how industrious the Japanese were. So they have, here we are with the daikon and the cucumbers, and here's the pictures of the cattle and the dairy things. There was an experimental flour growing station there, and here this is threshing of peas in order to be used to be sent away to the other camps. So how is the flow of the products? The Gila River and Poston, because it was so far south, they had 2 growing seasons, and Gila was the most productive. And just in the first year, first few months of being incarcerated, they were able to grow 275,000 pounds of produce, and by 1944, just in the first 6 months, they had, I think it was 15 million pounds of produce. And you can see the movement of all arrows lead and go away from Gila River. Tule Lake, as I mentioned earlier in the talk, was another place where farming was very important. They don't mention in this article, this is about farming in the desert, they don't mention the 2 camps that were in Arkansas, Jerome and Rower. These are kind of swampy kinds of lands. So here we see the Poston camp. This is unusual. Poston was unusual in that it didn't have any barbed wire. It was so isolated that they didn't need the barbed wire, but you can see here that, and also the other thing was that the farms were incorporated near the barracks. In the other camps, the farms were actually outside of the living areas. Here you see the Colorado River, and this long road, which was actually built as part of the incarceration, is Mojave Road, which still exists today. Here's an aerial view of the thing. I don't know why they had 3 separate camps, but one of the things that was done was, here's that Mojave Road, one of the roads that led to Parker, which is the town, the nearest town, and the place where the incarcerees were brought initially before they were sent down to these 3 camps. The other point about this is that they had nicknames, Roastin, Toastin, and Dustin, and that shows the kind of conditions under which they were living. And here's a picture of this young man actually trying, doing watering just to keep the dust down. The conditions were brutal, hot temperatures, windy, dusty. There was resistance at Poston in ways that more resistance than some of the other camps, although the other camps did have resistance. There were strikes, obviously the usual things about the type of jobs, the working conditions, but there was a general strike in Poston 1 in November of 42. There was some reform of the relations as a result of the strike, but other strikes continued that affected the production of food. Tractor drivers, warehouse workers, and even the mess hall workers had a strike. And this was the camp that had the most draft resistors. I mentioned the draft resistors in Heart Mountain. There were 63 of them. Here there were about 106, and it constituted 1/3 of all of the camp resistors that we're seeing. Just in terms of the community, there in Gila River, there is something called the Casa Grande Dispatch. I think it still is in, still published today a couple times a week. But what were they saying? What were these newspapers saying outside of the camp? Remember, I showed you the ones that were in the camp, but some of the messages that were, I read one of the issues, and it says, oh, this is good. People in the community, this is good. This is stimulating our local economy. It's going to mean that we're going to be more self-sufficient in terms of our food. We have a bunch of farm laborers now that we can use. This is going to be able to improve our local infrastructure. And this is a very patriotic thing to do. And please be tolerant. However, you can see here, and this is now in Poston, in front of the barber shop, Japs keep out, you rats. Another unusual thing about Poston was the presence of African Americans. They were much more numerous over other camps. Most of them were in the professions. Most of them were regarded well, although ashamedly, they faced some racist treatments, even by some of the Japanese American inmates. And in the town of Parker, that town, the nearest town nearest to the camps, they were only served in one of the restaurants and bars. And then finally, the issue of colonization post-war. And here's an announcement from the Office of Indian Affairs in the actual camp newsletter that they're bringing 16 Hopi Indian families to start colonizing the Parker Valley. And what they did was they actually put them in Poston Center's Unit 2. So I end this with this picture of Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady at the time. She had asked to visit a detention center. She was refused. She did not know anything about Japanese Americans before the war had started, but she had worked on African American civil rights issues. She had a public face as the First Lady, but she had a private face where she disagreed. She was against the mass removal. She worked behind the scenes to unfreeze the bank accounts of the Issei so they can access money to pay some of their bills. She worked with the American Friends Service Committees on a student leave program so students could actually go east and continue their schooling. She fought against federal workers actually losing their jobs. But as a person of her time, she also did favor assimilation and espouse this whole issue of the model minority. So here she is at Gila River. Gila River was the showcase camp. Here she is with Dylan Meyer. And she stayed for a 6-hour visit. And when asked about her experience, she said, well, it's not the most awful thing I've ever seen, but I wouldn't want to live there. And, I had a drink of milk and it was sour. And it was a subtle way of signaling that the inmates were not coddled, because there were rumors that the inmates were getting steaks and all these other foods that other people couldn't get. Again, this is a government photo. So we see the smiling Japanese Americans, even though they were incarcerated. So in summary, this power dynamics around food played out at the level of the camp administrators. It changed the power structure within the families, and it exposed the tension between the pro-American Japanese and the more traditional groups, partly generational, partly exacerbated by the WRA, and damaging to the point of death and additional restrictions and hardships. And the development of the camps for Japanese Americans on native land brought into relief how the US government actually subjugated and used these two communities for its own ends, with an additional layer of injustice to Native Americans in their own homeland. This is not an easy topic. It's a necessary one to understand, to repair, and to remember. And so I dedicate this talk and this research to my family, our friends, Japanese American, and our allies who suffered this injustice, and remembrance of February 19th, 1942, Executive Order 9066. We say never again is now, and we continue to say it even more today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful, wonderful presentation, Dr. Fujiwara. And I know people have already started rolling in with questions. So before we do that, I wanted to just say once again, it was so intriguing to see how food and agriculture had played such a pivotal role in the camps and in that power dynamic, as you were describing. And I think that there are some questions here about the camps themselves, but I think those are kind of being answered by, they were curious about the Poston Camp's Stone Tower Memorial. I'm not sure if you knew exactly where it was in your research. I know that Dean Tarasaki.
Oh yes, hi Dean. Hi Dean.
Might be answering that.
I met Dean for the first time last week. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, he's just saying the camps, it's in Camp 2. It's at 1/10 mile north of the monument on the west side of the road. You might be able to see the tower. Thank you, Dean.
Thank you, Dean. I know the monument. I didn't know where the tower was. Yeah.
Yeah, he also made a comment that I think is very resonant. He's saying mealtime meant that young people would eat with their friends and not their parents. That added to the breakdown.
That's exactly. If I didn't say that, I implicated that, showing the people in the mess halls eating with their friends. Yeah.
We have a question from a viewer. Did incarcerated people suffer any long-term health effects that you know of from the food that they had to eat during their time in the camp?
Well, yes. I mean, so especially in the early days when some of them were still in the detention centers, lots of cases of diarrhea. Foods can be spoiled. Refrigeration was not good. So yes, there were some ill effects of that, and who knows about the long-term effects. But certainly during the war, I mean, my expertise is in tuberculosis. Tuberculosis was one of the main illnesses that you could have that was just around in the United States in general, but it's certainly in the camps. If I look at the records, there's a lot of many people with tuberculosis suffering from tuberculosis.
I think there's also kind of a question out there about the redress effort and how many years it actually did take for the government to apologize. And there's actually somebody mentioning that, his father and grandfather were already deceased when the redress checks and apologies were distributed, and only his 87-year-old grandmother received the check and was unable to really recognize that it was you know, for that time that she had spent in the camps, and kind of that feeling of the call these days for African Americans to receive redress for possible enslaved ancestors, and kind of that dynamic, if you want to speak to any of that.
Absolutely. It wasn't until there was the redress movement happened, many hearings and things to really show like how terrible this situation was. Wasn't until 1988 that the apology was given, but as this person pointed out, by that time, many of my grandparents were dead too. I mean, all the older people who really suffered were dead, and they did not. So, and you know, and you can kind of say, you know, maybe they just extended it so they didn't have to pay as many people. You know, there's that issue. There are two other issues. One is the issue of the Japanese Latin Americans. I didn't speak at all about this, but there's a whole group of Japanese that were taken from their countries in Latin America, and Peru, for example, was a big one, and they were put in special camps. They did not get the reparations that the Japanese Americans got. And so they're still struggling today. And again, the people, many have died. This issue of HR 40, I think, is a very important one for at least a segment of the Japanese Americans, of which I am one. And the whole issue of studying. We've been trying for years to get Congress to just actually ask to study the whole issue of reparations for African Americans. It's Bill HR 40. We were getting really close in I think the last session of Congress, but it didn't go through. We tried to get an executive order through President Biden. It didn't go by June 19th, and that didn't work. So, but this is something that's going on in California, and it is something that some of us in the Japanese American community are very thinking that this is important. We as Japanese Americans were able to get our reparations, but this issue, and people go, oh, how can we do this? It's been so many generations. So this is just to study the issue. But we have to do this. There's never been an apology for this, for the enslavement of peoples, so of the African Americans. So it's something that, again, a portion of us think that it has to be looked at.
Absolutely. I think there's always that feeling of redress. There's also a question about, what about the Sansei, Nihonsei, and Gosei generations getting that redress if their parents couldn't get that redress? Is there, a way to kind of continue that healing and apology process? And I'm wondering if that is even something that the community is kind of putting in step with that HR 40 or thinking about in that way.
That's an interesting question. It almost, I mean, maybe others who are in the audience can speak to this, but I've not heard of this issue of, it was kind of, in a way, it was kind of closed in 1988. However, I looked to the Japanese Canadians. Japanese Canadians had their own issues. So the government apologized also in 1988, but in British Columbia, where most of them were, they're again on the West Coast, and they did not, the government, just in March, in the first couple of weeks of March, they opened this whole thing about this redressing the whole issue that happened in British Columbia and the apology. So it's now opened up again for at least the Japanese Canadians. I've not heard of this going on, but for the Yons, as you mentioned, the Sansei, some Sanseis were in the camp, and they are now elderly.
Mm-hmm.
If you think about it, 1945 was the last time you could be born in a camp. So you do the math.
Yeah.
So the youngest one is, they're in their late 70s or early 80s. They were children. So we don't, and then the ones that were born after the war, like me, the other Sansei, the Yonsei, that's fourth generation, the Gosei, the fifth generation, part of our desire is to keep this memory alive so we don't forget and that we don't make this happen again. I was very privileged to go to the Rower Jerome pilgrimage last weekend, 200 people, and this issue has come up so much. We have to remember, and youth have to remember, and we have to involve youth.
Absolutely. There's also questions pouring in. There's one about thank you for the powerful presentation. And do you know if any Japanese farmers stayed in Arizona and continued to farm following the war?
I don't know about Arizona per se, but let me say a couple things about that. There was this whole part of the reason that this land was developed was this settler movement. So, for example, Heart Mountain in Montana, the Japanese developed the land and everything like that. They were not allowed to bid for the land afterwards. It was given to white settlers. Tule Lake, also another settled place. Rower and Jerome, you weren't supposed to stay. So, except in Rower, there's one family, the Yadas that are left. And so, but I don't know specifically about Arizona.
What I could say on that topic is that perhaps there are a few families with the South Mountain flower gardens that were very popular as an attraction, as well as a flower producing region, right? Kind of nestled, if you know the area, baseline towards South Mountain in the Phoenix area. It was postcards made of it. Very much that line between a tourist attraction because of all the wonderful flowers that they grew, and then they were able to ship them out of state even. So there were quite a few Japanese American families that did farm that land, and I do believe a few of them were from the camps indeed, because that land is quite close to where they would have been in at least the Gila River area. So.
Okay.
We've got a few more here, and I think we have a few minutes here. There is one about how were babies fed, and how are the relations with the tribes today? Are the Native and Nikkei communities working together on wider education?
How the babies were fed, meaning
they might have been asking more about if there was formula, perhaps, or are we talking about dairy milk, or are we talking
yeah, you saw on that sign, I showed her that picture, milk only for the babies and things. So there was some shortage of the of milk products for the children. So yeah, so there were, and then even people who needed special foods, if they're diabetic or whatever, those kinds of things. So I've read reports from Heart Mountain and Gila River, where they did have special diets for certain groups, like high blood pressure, people have high blood pressure, diabetes, or whatever. So that was possible. The other issue of the relationship between the native populations and the Nikkei, my family was not in these camps, so I know that for example, the Gila River is on that land, and you must get permission to go onto that land. I was very lucky because my best friend, family, who I showed in that picture in the beginning of the Gila River section, her parents, her mother and her grandparents were on Gila River, so we were given the privilege of coming onto the land in September, which is where I met you. In Poston, the Colorado River Indian tribes, they have a museum, and they've actually have a corner. It's their history, but they also have a section that has the history of the Japanese Americans on their land. And I was able to visit that, and very appreciative. And I know that there is a relationship. There is the Poston group of survivors there. They work with there's a woman who's actually been fostering the relationship between the tribes and the Japanese Americans, especially the ones that were actually incarcerated at Poston.
I think we have just one more question, and that will be the final question we have for you today. But it's starting with it. It's scary to see some of the anti-Japanese signs and posters that were put up on the businesses and the neighborhoods. Do you see any correlation to today's current anti-Asian sentiments that we've seen over the past years, if not decades?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, this is something that we have to be totally vigilant. It's not just anti-Asian, it's anti-Muslim. It's anything it's anti whatever. But the fact is that, you know, living in California, you know, people in New York, you see the actual tangible evidence of people being attacked. So yes, very much scary. It's very scary to be in this situation even today, which is why I feel like it's not just it's any kind of this kind of whatever the anti that we have to band together and not just be on our own. It affects us all.
Absolutely. Well, that is our final question for the evening. I think that there's a lot of praise in the Q&A, just a wonderful round of applause for you and a thank you for the presentation and the information. I think we all enjoyed listening to you today. So we appreciate that, and we'll sign off here, and hopefully we'll get to meet once again in person sometime soon.
Yes, and I just really want to thank the Arizona Historical Society for letting my friend Sylvia and friend Kimiko Mar and I to spend 2 afternoons there combing through your files. It was really, really important for us. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. And anybody listening who comes to Arizona or who can find our website, you can I'm more than happy to help you find information in our collections on these topics. So please give us an email, phone call, or a visit. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.